Imagine an isolated farm in the Bavarian countryside. The nearest neighbors are far enough away that cry for help might disappear into the fields. It is early spring 1922 and winter has not entirely released its grip. At Hinterkaifeck, 6 people are about to vanish from ordinary life. For 4 days, no one will fully understand what has happened there. And when the truth is finally discovered, farm will already be crowded with questions that never receive answers. Hinterkaifeck was not the name of a village. It referred to a remote farmstead near the hamlet of Kaifeck, roughly 40 miles north of Munich. The property stood apart, surrounded by fields and woodland, with the farmhouse, barn, stable, and other working spaces connected beneath one roof. That layout mattered. A person could move between animals, storage areas, and living quarters without stepping outside. Especially useful during a cold Bavarian night, it also created dark, concealed spaces. The household was headed by Andreas Gruber and his wife, Cecilia. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, lived with them, along with her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. Andreas was known as stern and difficult, and the family appears to have lived somewhat apart from the surrounding community. Still, this was not a forgotten household. Neighbors knew their routines. People expected to see the children at school and the adults at church or in town. There were tensions behind the farm's closed doors. Andreas and Victoria had previously been convicted of an incestuous relationship, a fact that cast a long shadow over later theories. Questions also surrounded Joseph's paternity. A neighbor named Lawrence Schlittenbauer had once acknowledged he might be the father, then disputed it. Those circumstances would later draw intense attention. But personal scandal is not proof of murder, and much of what followed became tangled with rumor, resentment, and hindsight. Now here's where it gets strange. In the days before the killings, Andreas reportedly noticed footprints in the snow leading from the nearby woods toward the farm. According to later accounts, he could not find a matching trail leading away. That story has become central to the mystery. Although the surviving reports are not perfectly consistent, even so, the image is unsettling, tracks approaching an isolated home and no clear sign that whoever made them ever left. Andreas was also said to have heard footsteps or noises coming from the attic. He searched but apparently found no intruder. A house key was reportedly missing, and a newspaper appeared on the property that no one in the family had purchased, each detail on its own. Could have an innocent explanation. Old buildings make noise, objects are misplaced, newspapers travel, taken together though they suggest that Andreas believed something unusual was happening around his home. There was another warning, at least in the way the story was later told. A former maid had left the farm months earlier, reportedly saying she believed the place was haunted because of unexplained sounds. That claim is often repeated, but we should be careful with it. Memories change after a tragedy, and eerie details grow sharper in retelling. What matters is that more than one account described disturbances inside the farm before the murders, whether supernatural in imagination or entirely human in cause. On Friday, March 31st, 1922, a new maid arrived. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was 44 years old and had difficulty walking, so her sister accompanied her to the farm. Maria had barely settled into her room before the household entered its final evening. For her, Hinterkaifeck was not a familiar place filled with old conflicts. It was a new job. She had likely been there only a matter of hours when the attack began. No surviving witness could establish the precise sequence. Investigators believed 4 members of the family were somehow drawn one after another into the barn. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia were found there later, close together and partly covered with hay. Whether they heard an animal, responded to a noise, or went looking for another family member is unknown. The killer may have relied on familiarity with the farm and confidence that each person would enter the same confined space. The weapon was believed to be a mattock, a heavy agricultural tool used for breaking soil and cutting roots. In German records, it was described as a Ruthaw. The victims in the barn suffered devastating injuries to the head. There was no sign of a chaotic confrontation spreading across the entire property. Instead, the location and arrangement suggested a controlled series of attacks. That interpretation is chilling, but it remains an interpretation reconstructed after the fact, not a witnessed account. Inside the living quarters, 2 more people were killed. 2-year-old Joseph was found in his cot, and Maria Baumgartner was discovered in the room assigned to her. Unlike the 4 victims in the barn, neither appears to have been lured anywhere. The attacker went into the house to reach them. That suggests the killer intended to leave no surviving member of the household, including a newly arrived employee who may have known almost nothing about the family. The attack was brutal, but not necessarily quick for everyone. Evidence from the barn indicated that 7-year-old Cecilia may have survived for some time after being injured. Investigators noted that she had pulled out clumps of her own hair, possibly while lying beneath the hay. It is one of the hardest details in the case, and it should not be embellished. What it tells us simply is that the silence afterward may have concealed suffering as well as death. So let's pause there. 6 people were dead by the beginning of April. But life at Hinterkaifeck did not appear to stop. The cattle were fed, milk seems to have been taken from the cows. Food was consumed in the house, and there were signs that fires had been maintained. Smoke was reportedly seen rising from the chimney. Whoever remained on the property understood basic farm routines, or at least knew enough to keep the animals alive. This is the detail that turns a horrific crime into something even more disturbing. Evidence suggested that someone stayed at Hinterkaifeck after the killings, moving through the same connected rooms where the bodies lay. The person may have eaten there and slept there. The watchdog was reportedly tended, and the livestock did not go unfed. Was the killer hiding, searching for something, or simply behaving as though the farm now belonged to them? No evidence gives us a reliable answer. Meanwhile, the family's absence began to register. Young Kazilia did not appear at school. The family missed Sunday church services, and Victoria did not attend a scheduled choir rehearsal. Mail accumulated. A coffee seller reportedly came to the property and received no response. A repairman also visited to work on an engine and completed his task without encountering the household. Hinterkaifeck was occupied by signs of normal farm activity, yet the people who belonged there had disappeared. On Tuesday, April 4th. Concern finally led several men to the farm. Among them was Lawrence Schlittenbauer, the neighbor whose relationship with Victoria and dispute over Joseph's paternity would later make him a central figure in public suspicion. The men entered the barn and found the 4 bodies beneath hay. They then moved into the living area where Joseph and Maria were discovered. 4 days after the probable night of the attack, the crime was no longer hidden. But the scene was not preserved in the way a modern investigation would demand. Villagers entered the property before it was properly secured. People walked through rooms, moved near the bodies, handled objects, and gathered to see what had happened. Some even prepared food in the kitchen. Their behavior can seem astonishing now, but rural crime scenes in 1922 were managed very differently by the time trained investigators arrived. Footprints and other fragile traces had been mixed together. Police officers and investigators came from Munich, traveling into a community already filled with fear and speculation. They photographed the scene and arranged post-mortem examinations at the farm. The examination focused heavily on the victim's skull injuries, and the heads were removed for further study. Those remains were later lost, apparently during the upheaval surrounding the Second World War. That loss denied future investigators the possibility of applying modern forensic techniques to some of the most important physical evidence. Robbery was considered, but it did not fit neatly. Money and valuables were found at the farm, including significant cash reserves. The household was not obviously ransacked in the manner expected from thieves searching in haste. Still, investigators could not be certain whether something specific had been taken. A targeted document, personal object, or hidden sum might leave no obvious absence. The killer's continued presence also seemed unusual for a robber, who would normally want to escape as quickly as possible. Investigators looked at people who knew the family, strangers passing through the region, laborers, former employees, and men with possible grudges. Hinterkaifeck existed in a country still dealing with the consequences of the First World War. Veterans, displaced workers, and itinerant travelers moved through Bavaria, and violent crime was a real concern. Yet a random outsider would have needed unusual confidence to remain at the property, care for the animals, and navigate the connected farm buildings without attracting attention. Lawrence Schlittenbauer became the most discussed suspect. He had a complicated history with Victoria and had been involved in the paternity dispute concerning Joseph. Witnesses also found some of his behavior during the discovery unusual. He reportedly entered areas of the property with confidence and moved the bodies while searching. At times, he offered explanations that others considered suspicious, but Schlittenbauer said he was looking for his son, and no physical evidence conclusively tied him to the murders. Years later, rumors about Schlittenbauer continued. Villagers repeated comments he supposedly made and argued over whether he knew details only the killer should have known. He strongly denied responsibility and took legal action against people who accused him. The problem is familiar in unsolved cases. Once a community settles on a suspect, almost every gesture can be reinterpreted as guilt. Suspicion may be justified, but repetition does not transform rumor into evidence. Authorities never obtained enough to charge him. Another theory focused on Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, who had officially died during the First World War. Some imagined that he had survived, returned secretly, and discovered Joseph was not his child. That idea offered a dramatic motive, but investigators found no credible evidence that Karl had lived beyond the war. Other accounts pointed to mysterious soldiers or brothers with criminal histories. These stories expanded over the decades, but none produced a documented chain connecting a suspect to Hinterkaifeck that night. Then there is the possibility of someone already hiding on the property. The footprints, attic noises, missing key, and unfamiliar newspaper could indicate that an intruder had been watching the family from within or nearby. The large, connected building offered places to conceal oneself, if true. That might explain the killer's knowledge of routines and willingness to stay afterward, but it raises another question. Why would Andreas, after noticing so many warning signs, remain without seeking sustained help? Perhaps the danger never seemed real enough. We also have to distinguish evidence recorded at the time from details polished by decades of storytelling. The footprint account, the haunted maid, and the exact activities after the murders are often presented as settled facts. In reality, some came through witness statements, second-hand recollections, or later summaries. That does not make them false. It means each detail carries a different level of certainty. Hinterkaifeck is especially vulnerable to myth because the verified core of the case is already so unsettling. One major piece of evidence remained hidden in plain sight. The bloodstained mattock believed to be the murder weapon was not recovered during the first search. It was concealed within the building and found only when the farm was demolished in February of 1923, nearly a year later. That delay speaks to the limitations of the original examination. It may also suggest that the killer deliberately returned the tool to a place where it would not be easily noticed. The demolition ended Hinterkaifeck as a physical place, but not as an investigation. Munich police opened more than 100 investigative proceedings over the decades. Witnesses were interviewed and re-interviewed, tips arrived, suspects were compared, dismissed, reconsidered, and sometimes revived after death, yet no one was charged. Each passing year weakened memories, removed witnesses, and reduced the chance that a confession or overlooked document would provide a clean resolution. Later investigators and independent researchers revisited the surviving files, sometimes using modern profiling ideas. A police academy team reportedly examined the case in the early 21st century and reached a view about the most likely suspect, but withheld the name out of concern for living relatives and because the evidence could not support a prosecution. That outcome is revealing. Even careful modern analysis may produce a strong theory. But a theory is not the same as proof beyond reasonable doubt. What can be said with confidence? 6 people were killed at Hinterkaifeck around the night of March 31, 1922. 4 were found in the barn and 2 were found inside the farmhouse. A mattock from the property was identified as the likely weapon. The killer, or someone connected to the crime, appears to have remained afterward and maintained parts of the farm. The scene was contaminated before investigators could secure it, and the weapon was missed for months. Beyond that, certainty quickly gives way. We do not know whether the victims entered the barn one at a time by coincidence or design. We do not know whether the killer hid in the attic, arrived openly, or was welcomed into the home. We do not know whether the motive involved family conflict, paternity, money, revenge, or something never recorded. And we cannot say with confidence whether the person responsible was questioned, watched from the crowd, or vanished without ever becoming a suspect. Hinterkaifeck endures because the mystery is built from ordinary things made threatening. Footprints in snow, sounds above a ceiling, a key that cannot be found, animals fed by unseen hands. But behind those details were 6 individual lives, including 2 children and a woman on her first day of work. More than a century later, the responsible person has never been established in court. The farm is gone, the witnesses are gone, and the silence surrounding those 4 days remains unbroken.